Sofia Plata, in her early 70s, was a figure of resilience carved by time. Her days began and ended in the small garden of the house she had inherited from her parents, an oasis of color and life amidst the dust of a forgotten working-class neighborhood in the vastness of Mexico. The hands that tended the roses with an almost surgical delicacy were the same ones that, in silence, clenched into fists upon hearing the sound of motorcycles tearing through the street's peace. Her life had been a straight line of devotion to her sister and her home, but beneath the surface of a placid routine, a cauldron of fear and resentment simmered. She watched the world around her deteriorate, impunity flourishing like a weed, and felt the fragility of her existence as a constant threat. Stories like Sofia and Leticia's deserve to be told, and for me to continue bringing these accounts, I need your help. If you are watching this, please subscribe to the channel and comment what city you're from. Our goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers so that more people can learn of the hidden strength behind fragile appearances. At her side, Leticia Plata was the devout and trembling counterpoint. Where Sofia displayed a hardened shell, Leticia took refuge in faith, her thin, pale fingers constantly sliding over the beads of a worn rosary. The kitchen was her sanctuary. The aroma of cinnamon and sugar from the sweets she sold a fragile attempt to sweeten an increasingly bitter reality. She personified the fear that Sofia refused to express openly. Every shout in the street, every distant siren, was a harbinger of the end for Leticia. Her life was a cycle of prayers for protection and a continuous effort to maintain normality, ignoring the fact that the walls of her house seemed to shrink each day, turning their refuge into a potential trap. The dynamic between the two was a delicate balance between Leticia's frightened denial and Sofia's grim pragmatism, a silent dance of two cornered souls. The house on Calle de los Olvidos was more than a structure of bricks and mortar. It was the repository of their entire existence. In it, they were born, watched their parents grow old and pass away, and promised each other they would end their days there. Every creaking piece of furniture, every yellowed photograph on the wall, every worn tile told the story of a simple, contained life. This home was the materialization of their identity, a bastion of order and decency in a world sinking into chaos. The idea of abandoning that place was unthinkable, as it would mean abandoning themselves, erasing their own memories. The house was the only territory they controlled, and the growing external threat transformed the routine of locking the doors and windows into a sacred ritual, a desperate prayer for inviolability in an environment that no longer respected boundaries. The neighborhood, a tangle of unpaved streets and houses with iron bars on the windows, lived under an unwritten law, dictated by El Chacal's gang. The police were a ghostly presence, appearing only to collect bribes or to perform useless formalities after some tragedy. This vacuum of authority created an atmosphere of resignation and collective fear. Neighbors greeted each other with lowered gazes, and conversations died when the young gang members passed by, flaunting their power with arrogance. The community, once united by neighborly bonds, was now fragmented by terror. Everyone knew who was in charge, who extorted, and who punished. The Plata sisters, with their apparent fragility, were seen as the weakest link in this chain, inevitable targets in an ecosystem where predation had become the norm and survival depended on becoming invisible. The morning routine of going to the local market was an exercise in calculated tension. Sofia and Leticia walked arm in arm, a moving picture of fragility, but their eyes registered everything. The lookout on the corner, the suspicious car parked down the street, the faces of the young men who watched them with a mixture of disdain and greed. On one of these days, while they were choosing vegetables, a gang member, a young man with a cruel smile, deliberately bumped into Leticia, nearly knocking her over. His apology was a veiled insult, his gaze lingering on the worn purse she clutched tightly. No one intervened. The silence of the other shoppers was deafening, a testament to the collective paralysis. In that moment, the audience's empathy solidifies as the scene reveals not only the aggressor's malice, but also the silent complicity of a terrorized society. Back in the safety of their house, the incident echoed between the walls. Leticia, with trembling hands, tried to pray, but the words caught in her throat. "We should leave, Sofia," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Leave to where, Leticia? To die of sadness in the home of a distant relative who barely knows us?" Sofia replied, her voice low but sharp as glass. The dilemma was clear and paralyzing. To stay meant living under the constant shadow of violence, an agonizing wait for the inevitable. To leave meant surrendering, admitting defeat, and abandoning the only world they had ever known. In that dialogue, the character's internal conflict deepens, Leticia's shaken faith colliding with Sofia's wounded pride and latent fury, as she began to understand that resignation was just another word for annihilation. Sofia's transformation began to manifest in small gestures. The way she sharpened the kitchen knives every night, the rhythmic metallic sound echoing through the silent house, was more than a household chore. There was an intensity in her gaze, a concentration that transcended the simple preparation of food. She watched the street through a crack in the curtain for long periods, mapping the gang's movements, studying their habits like a predator analyzes its prey. Leticia saw these changes and shrank away, feeling a new kind of fear, not only of the outside world, but of the darkness that seemed to be awakening within her own sister. Sofia's motivation was solidifying, shifting from passive fear to a cold resolution. If no one would protect them, they would have to learn to protect themselves, whatever the cost. The atmosphere in the house changed. The silence, once synonymous with peace, was now charged with a palpable tension. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to mark a countdown to an unknown and dreaded event. The house, with its locked doors and shuttered windows, had become a fortress, but also a prison. The sisters' routine, once a comfort, was now a silent preparation for war. They continued to make their sweets, tend their garden, and go to Mass on Sundays, maintaining a facade of normality for the outside world. But inside, the gears of an irreversible change were already in motion. The question was no longer if violence would knock on their door, but when. And Sofia, in her terrifying silence, was already determined not to be found unprepared. The rotten peace of that night was broken not by a crash, but by the whisper of glass being removed. The sound, almost imperceptible, was enough to wake Sofia from her light sleep. She lay motionless, her heart hammering against her ribs as she heard the soft creak of the living room floorboards. It was them. The shadows that had haunted their nights had finally materialized inside their sanctuary. 3 male figures, young and lean, moved with an arrogant familiarity, their silhouettes cut by the pale moonlight filtering through the broken window. Leticia, in her room, let out a muffled whimper, a sound of pure animal terror that was quickly silenced. Fear was a physical presence, cold and paralyzing, filling every corner of the house, suffocating the air and announcing that the world they knew had just been irrevocably violated. The violence was swift, efficient, and inhuman. They were not content to steal. They needed to humiliate. While one of them held Leticia, whose faith dissolved into silent tears, the other 2 ransacked the house with sadistic contempt. Drawers were pulled out, the mattress was torn, and the small metal box where they kept their savings was found and kicked open. The leader of the trio, a young man with empty eyes, laughed as he counted the few bills. "Is this all you've got, old women? For a lifetime of work?" he sneered, throwing the coins on the floor. He shoved Sofia, who fell heavily onto the shattered glass of a picture frame of her parents. The physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of her powerlessness, of the mockery that echoed in her ears, branding her fragility like a sentence. When the front door finally slammed shut, The silence that settled in was more deafening than the shouts and laughter. For long minutes the two sisters remained where they had been left. Leticia curled up on the kitchen floor, shaking uncontrollably, and Sofia sitting amidst the wreckage of her life. Sofia's gaze, however, held no tears. There was a cold, terrifying clarity in her eyes. She rose slowly, ignoring the cut on her hand, and her first act was not to comfort her sister, but to survey the scene with analytical precision. She registered every broken item, every dirty footprint on the floor, every trace of the invasion. The violation had not just broken their belongings, it had broken something inside her, shattering her fear and resignation. And in their place, a cold, dangerous calm began to settle. The next day, the humiliation continued at the police station, a place that reeked of cynicism and stale coffee. Detective Morales, a heavy-set man in a stained shirt, listened to their story with ill-disguised boredom, interrupting them with questions that were, in themselves, accusations. "But you didn't hear anything. You're not sure who they were. In this neighborhood, everyone knows everyone," he said, implying complicity or, at best, senile naivety. At the end of their statement, he closed his notebook with a gesture of annoyance. "Be grateful you're alive. There's not much we can do. It's just local kids having fun. I recommend you reinforce your locks," he concluded, dismissing their pain as a trivial inconvenience. That official neglect was the second blow, crueler than the first, for it confirmed that to the world they did not exist. They were alone. The walk home was made in a heavy silence, under a sun that seemed to mock the darkness they felt. Leticia mumbled fragments of prayers, resigned to a fate of suffering. It was then that Sofia stopped abruptly in the middle of the dusty street. She turned to her sister, and for the first time, Leticia saw the complete absence of fear in her eyes. In its place was a steely resolve. "Enough praying, Leticia. God doesn't live in this neighborhood anymore," Sofia said, her voice firm and emotionless. "No one is coming to save us. If we want peace, we will have to plant it ourselves over the bodies of those who took ours." It was in that moment of total abandonment that the decision was made. If you have ever felt invisible and unprotected, if you understand that there are times when the only response to cruelty is force, I ask you to subscribe and support this channel. It is so that stories of surpassed limits, like that of the Plata sisters, are never forgotten. In the days that followed the decision, the Plata sisters' house was transformed. The physical disorder was meticulously erased, every shard of glass swept away, every object returned to its place. However, the atmosphere was permanently altered. A frigid silence, once filled with fear, now harbored a dark resolve. Sofia moved with a renewed and terrifying purpose. She didn't speak of what they would do, but her actions were eloquent. She bought rat poison, claiming an infestation in the cellar, and watched the street with the patience of a bird of prey. Leticia, in turn, became her sister's shadow, her movements hesitant, her eyes wide with dread. She was an accomplice chained by fear, unable to move forward, yet too terrified to retreat. The house, clean and orderly, had become the headquarters for a silent war that only they knew had been declared. The opportunity soon presented itself, as if fate itself were conspiring with their macabre plan. A week after the invasion, the youngest and most arrogant of the assailants returned, alone. He knocked on the door with the insolence of someone who knows he is untouchable, demanding a weekly payment to protect them. The smile on his face was the same one that haunted Leticia's nightmares. He was the personification of the impunity that consumed them. While Leticia retreated into the shadows of the kitchen, Sofia opened the door and, with a calmness that would freeze the blood, offered the young man a fragile, submissive smile. She invited him in for a glass of cool water, explaining that the money was put away and she needed to get it. The criminal, blinded by his own arrogance, walked without hesitation into the web that had just been woven. The scene that unfolded next was a masterpiece of domestic horror. Sofia asked him to sit at the kitchen table, the same place where they had eaten their breakfast for 50 years. She offered him a plate of hot stew, a gesture of hospitality that would disarm anyone who did not know the darkness forming in her soul. Leticia, moving like an automaton, served the plate, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped it. The aggressor didn't notice or didn't care. He was more interested in boasting about his power, in describing what would happen to them if they didn't pay. Every word was another nail in his own coffin, strengthening the resolve of the two women who watched him with a mortal stillness. The preparation of that meal had been an unholy ritual. Hours earlier, Sofia had taken the bottle of Leticia's potent sleeping pills, prescribed for her sleepless nights, and crushed a dozen of them into a fine white powder. To this powder, she mixed the granulated rat poison, a lethal combination disguised by the stew's strong spices. Leticia watched the process in a catatonic silence, horror paralyzing her ability to intervene. The woman who had taught her to pray now taught her how to prepare death. The act was carried out with an emotionless precision, as if Sofia were merely following a recipe. The kitchen, once a place of comfort and sweet aromas, had become a poison laboratory, and the sisters' transformation was complete. From victims to executioners, the wait was the longest part. The young man ate voraciously, complaining about the quality of the food between mouthfuls, oblivious to the poison invading his bloodstream. The sisters sat across from him in silence, watching. Every chew, every sip of water was a sound amplified in the unbearable tension of the kitchen. The minutes dragged on like hours. Then the first signs appeared. A deep yawn, a complaint of tiredness, his head beginning to feel heavy. He tried to stand, confused, but his legs wouldn't obey. His eyes widened in a flash of belated understanding, but it was too late. He slumped to the side, his body hitting the floor with a dull, definitive thud. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Leticia's stifled sob. The reality of what they had done fell upon them with the weight of a tombstone. The body on the kitchen floor was a threshold they had crossed with no possibility of return. Leticia collapsed into convulsive weeping, a mixture of terror, guilt, and a sickening relief. Sofia, however, remained standing, her face a mask of exhaustion and determination. She approached the body, not with fear, but with a cold curiosity, checking the pulse to be sure. "It's over," she said, her voice hoarse. "The first one. The rest will follow." In that moment, the chasm between the two sisters became clear. Leticia saw a mortal sin, an eternal damnation. Sofia saw the first step toward reclaiming her peace, an act of dirty but necessary justice in a world that only understood the language of brute force. The work that followed was grim and gruesome. Under Sofia's command, they dragged the heavy body to the small, damp cellar they rarely used. The physical exertion tested their aged bodies, every muscle screaming in protest. The contact with the inert flesh, the smell of sweat and death, was a sensory ordeal that threatened to break what little remained of Leticia's sanity. But Sofia's determination was unshakable. She cleaned every drop of blood, every trace of the crime, with terrifying efficiency. By dawn, the house was immaculate again, as if nothing had happened. But the presence of the body beneath their feet was a constant reminder. They were no longer just the frail Plata sisters. They were the guardians of a terrible secret, murderers who had turned their home into a tomb. A week passed in agonizing silence. Every knock on the door, every car that slowed down on the street, was a cause for panic for Leticia. Sofia, however, watched and waited. No one came looking for the young man. No police car, no gang member. The absence of consequences was the confirmation Sofia needed. These men were disposable, pawns in a violent game whose disappearance mattered to no one, least of all, the police. This realization was liberating. The fear of discovery was replaced by a growing sense of power and invulnerability. The impunity that had once protected them now protected her. They had found the flaw in the system and were ready to exploit it to the end with a coldness they never knew they possessed. "Our garden is infested, Leticia," Sofia said one afternoon, as she pruned her rose bushes with sharp shears. "When a pest appears, it's no use just cutting off one leaf. You have to pull the weed out by the root, one by one, until the bed is clean again. Otherwise it comes back, stronger and hungrier." The metaphor was clear and chilling. The garden, their pride and refuge, became the model for their extermination campaign. Gardening, with its logic of purification and elimination of the unwanted, provided the twisted moral framework for their actions. They did not see themselves as monsters, but as caretakers, cleaning their small piece of the world from the filth that threatened to suffocate it. With every rose that bloomed, they felt more justified in their deadly crusade. The next target was chosen carefully. He was another of the invaders, a man known for his greed. Sofia, using a gossipy neighbor as an unwitting pawn, spread the rumor that they had received a small inheritance from a distant cousin. The bait was simple but irresistible. They knew the news would reach the right ears, and greed would do the rest of the work. The plan demonstrated an evolution in their strategy. They were no longer just reacting. They were actively hunting. The house, once a fortress of defense, had now become a trap, and they, the quiet ladies who sold sweets, were the patient spiders at the center of the web, waiting for the next vibration, the next victim to become entangled. In the midst of their dark plans, the routine of normality was maintained with impeccable rigor. Father Miguel, oblivious to the darkness that had settled in his most devout parishioners, made his monthly visit. He sat in their living room, praising their strength and resilience in the face of the tribulations of the modern world. "Your faith is an inspiration, my sisters," he said, sipping the tea that Leticia served him with trembling hands. The irony of the scene was suffocating. They accepted his blessings, nodded at his words of comfort, while in the cellar, the body of the first aggressor began to decompose. This double life was their greatest burden and their most effective weapon, allowing them to operate in plain sight, hidden behind a veil of piety and fragility. The second criminal did not take long to take the bait. He showed up under the pretext of offering extra security now that they had money, his eyes shining with greed. The script repeated itself, but this time with terrifying efficiency. Leticia's hesitation had vanished, replaced by a numb resignation. Sofia's calm was even deeper, almost serene. The stew was served, the small talk was made, and the poison acted just as quickly. The second body was dragged to the cellar and placed beside the first. The act, which the first time had been a seismic trauma, now felt terribly routine. They were becoming efficient, the horror being replaced by a grim pragmatism. With every life they took, a piece of their own humanity died along with it. The validation for their actions came from an unexpected source. From the kitchen window, they saw Anna, the young single mother who lived down the street, being cornered by a third gang member. He was verbally harassing her, demanding money, while Anna's young child clung to her, skirt, crying. The sisters watched the scene, and a new kind of anger surged in Sofia. It wasn't just about their own safety now. It was about the powerlessness of all the innocents in the neighborhood. The man tormenting Anna was one of those who had invaded their home. In that moment, he became the next on the list. Their mission expanded, from personal revenge to a twisted form of community justice. They would be the exterminating angels that no one asked for, but that, in their judgment, everyone needed. As she watched Anna's aggressor finally walk away, Sofia felt a clarity she had never experienced. Peace was not a gift. It was an achievement, and the price was higher than she had imagined. The path they had chosen was lonely and had no return, a descent into hell in search of a private paradise. I know that many watching may judge, but how many have been pushed to the edge, abandoned by all? If you understand the darkness that can lead good people to terrible acts, and if you Believe their stories need to be heard, then join our community. Your subscription is what allows me to continue exploring these uncomfortable truths, showing that the line between victim and villain is sometimes dangerously thin. The third target was lured with new bait, the promise of information about the disappearance of his comrades. Sofia, using a public telephone, made an anonymous call, suggesting that the old women on the corner knew something. Curiosity and suspicion led him straight into the trap. This time, the act was even colder and more mechanical. There was no longer the initial shock or moral hesitation. There was only a problem and a solution. The man who harassed Anna met his end in the same kitchen with the same poisoned stew. His body joined the others in the cellar, the sweetish stench of death beginning to become a real problem. The Plata sisters' house was becoming a mausoleum, and the garden above, a future cemetery. The serial disappearances began to generate a buzz of fear and speculation in the neighborhood. 3 members of El Chacal's gang had vanished without a trace. The initial narrative that they had fled or been killed by a rival gang began to lose steam. The streets seemed quieter, but it was a silence charged with paranoia. People locked their doors earlier. The remaining criminals moved with less arrogance, looking over their shoulders. Unknowingly, the Plata sisters had altered the local crime ecosystem. They, the 2 most insignificant figures in the neighborhood, were now the invisible predator at the top of the food chain, and their hunt was far from over. The news reached the ears of El Chacal. He was not a leader by chance. His brutality was matched by his cunning. The coincidence was too great to be ignored. 3 of his men, all last seen in the same area, near the house of the 2 old women who had been robbed. At first, the idea was absurd, laughable, but the absence of bodies or ransom demands intrigued him. He began to watch from a distance, using his informants to map the sisters' routine. Their image, fragile and harmless, going to church and tending their garden, was a perfect disguise. So perfect that it became suspicious. El Chacal's intuition, sharpened by years of survival in the underworld, told him that the answer to the mystery lay in that modest house. The official investigation, in contrast, was a farce. Detective Morales was forced by his superiors to ask a few questions about the missing young men. He visited the sisters' house again, his attitude even more bored and dismissive. Sofia and Leticia played their roles to perfection. Leticia whimpered about the fear she felt, while Sofia talked about how the neighborhood was becoming more dangerous, thanking God they were alive. "We haven't seen anything, Detective. We're just 2 old women. We hardly leave the house," Sofia said, offering him a sweet. Morales accepted, dismissing them as useless witnesses. His inability to see beyond the facade of fragility was his greatest mistake, a mistake that would seal the fate of El Chacal and his men. The constant pressure began to erode the sisters' alliance. Leticia was falling apart. She had vivid nightmares, waking up screaming with the faces of her victims. She could barely eat, and guilt consumed her, causing her to pray for hours on end, asking for a forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve. Sofia, on the other hand, grew increasingly hard, more pragmatic. Compassion had been cauterized, replaced by a survivalist logic. "Your screams will give us away," Sofia hissed at her sister during one night of terror. "They were monsters, Leticia. It was either their lives or ours." The conflict between one's paralyzing guilt and the other's implacable justification created a rift in their relationship, a tension that threatened to explode at any moment. The hunt nearly ended in disaster with the 4th victim. Lured by the promise of a payment to forget what he saw, the 4th man was more cautious. He refused to eat, accepting only a cup of coffee. Sofia, anticipating this possibility, had drugged the sugar. However, the poison took longer to take effect. The man realized something was wrong and tried to get up to leave. In a moment of panic and adrenaline-fueled strength, Sofia struck him on the back of the head with a heavy iron skillet. The confrontation was chaotic and loud. Leticia, overcoming her dread, helped her sister subdue the struggling man. They won by a narrow margin, hearts pounding, breathless and covered in sweat. The experience was a brutal reminder that they were on a knife's edge. The cellar was no longer a viable option. Space was running out and the odor of decomposition was beginning to subtly seep through the house, a constant threat of discovery. Sofia's solution was as ingenious as it was macabre. Under the cover of darkness, night after night, they began a new task. They dug shallow graves in their beloved garden, under the densest rose bushes and bougainvillea plants. The bodies were dismembered, a horrendous job that tested the limits of Leticia's sanity, and buried in parts. The garden, which had always been a symbol of life and beauty, became a clandestine cemetery. The flowers, more vibrant than ever, were fed by the mortal remains of their enemies. Death nourished life in a terrible and poetic symbiosis. El Chacal's surveillance intensified. He was no longer discreet. A car with tinted windows was parked for hours at the end of the street. One of his men began to follow the sisters on their rare trips to the market. Sofia and Leticia felt the net closing in around them. The sense of power they had experienced was replaced by the old familiar feeling of being prey. The difference was that now they were no longer defenseless lambs. They were cornered wolves, and a cornered wolf is the most dangerous of animals. They knew the final confrontation was inevitable. El Chacal would come in person. The question was not if, but how they would be prepared to receive him. The woman Sofia saw in the mirror was no longer the same. The resignation in her eyes had been replaced by a hard, calculating glint. The wrinkles on her face seemed to have been carved not by time, but by violence and the weight of secrets. She had begun this journey for survival, to protect her home and her sister. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Fear had given way to a kind of dark exultation with each successful plan. The elimination of the pests had become an end in itself. She had discovered within herself a capacity for cruelty and efficiency that frightened her and at the same time empowered her. She was no longer a victim defending herself. She was a predator who had acquired a taste for blood. It was the sight of El Chacal himself that finally cemented Leticia's resolve. One afternoon, she saw him inside the dark car, watching the house with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. In that instant, all her guilt and moral hesitation evaporated, replaced by the most basic instinct of all, self-preservation. She understood what Sofia had known for a long time. There was no turning back. Asking God for forgiveness would not save them from El Chacal. The only possible absolution would come from eliminating the final threat. The terror of being discovered and subjected to the gang's brutal revenge was greater than her terror of sin. She turned to Sofia, her eyes finally free of tears and filled with a somber resolve. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice firm for the first time. Knowing that the confrontation was imminent, the Plata sisters turned their home into a deadly trap. They would not wait passively for the attack. The phase of luring individual prey was over. Now they prepared for the alpha predator. They mapped every inch of the house, every creaking floorboard, every blind spot. They used their domestic knowledge for lethal ends. Nylon threads stretched at ankle height, pans of boiling oil ready on the stove, the heavy statue of a saint positioned to be knocked from the top of a cabinet. The house, which had been their sanctuary, then their trap and their tomb, now readied itself for its final battle. It would be the stage where intelligence and knowledge of the terrain would face brute force in the definitive fight for survival. The night of the confrontation arrived with a storm. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, as if nature itself were announcing the violence to come. Then, in a lull in the thunder, the sound came, a single, firm, imperious knock on the door. It was not the knock of a henchman. It was that of a king coming to collect his tribute. Sofia and Leticia exchanged a look that contained a lifetime of fear and a week of deadly preparation. With her heart hammering in her chest, Sofia walked to the door. Taking a deep breath to control the tremor in her voice, she asked who it was. The reply came, muffled and full of menace. "Open the door, old woman. El Chacal has come to pay a visit." She turned the key, and the imposing, heavy-set figure of their tormentor filled the doorway, bringing with him the smell of rain and death. El Chacal entered the dim light of the living room, his eyes sweeping the space with contempt. He expected to find two women cowering in fear, ready to beg for their lives. "Where are my men?" he snarled, taking a step forward. It was at that moment his foot caught on the nylon thread, stretched inches from the floor. He stumbled, his large, heavy body lurching forward with a grunt of surprise. His reflexes saved him from a complete fall, but the imbalance was the cue. From the top of the stairs, Leticia, with a strength born of pure terror, pushed a heavy fern pot. The pot fell and shattered on El Chacal's shoulder with a dull, brutal impact. He roared, a sound of fury and pain, realizing too late that this was not a house. It was a trap. The pain turned El Chacal's anger into blind rage. Ignoring his throbbing shoulder, he lunged toward Sofia, who was already moving with surprising agility for her age. She slipped behind the sofa, using the furniture as obstacles, and ran toward the kitchen. He followed, breathing heavily, smashing a small end table and shattering a lifetime of memories in his path. To him, the house was a claustrophobic labyrinth, but for the sisters, every inch was known territory, mapped by decades of routine. He was the bull, and they were the matadors, guiding him patiently to the final arena, the place where they had already shed so much blood. The kitchen. The narrow hallway echoed with his curses and the sound of his heavy footsteps. As he burst through the kitchen door, the first thing he saw was Leticia, standing near the stove, her face pale as wax. A cruel smile formed on his lips as he advanced on her, the easier prey. However, his peripheral vision failed to register Sofia emerging from the dark pantry beside him. Before he could react, a handful of chili powder, ground and saved for this exact moment, was thrown in his face. The burning was immediate and excruciating. He screamed, bringing his hands to his eyes, blinded and disoriented. At the same instant, Leticia, acting on pure instinct, tipped the skillet of hot oil that was boiling on the stove. The scalding liquid hit El Chacal's chest and arm, and his cry of pain turned into an inhuman howl of agony. Even wounded and blind, El Chacal was a force of nature. He thrashed about like a caged animal, his arms flailing, destroying cabinets and dishes. In a desperate stroke of luck, his hand found Leticia's arm and he pulled her toward him, using her frail body as a human shield. The fight became intimate and brutal. The smell of burnt oil and chili mixed with the metallic scent of blood where Sofia had cut his arm with a vegetable knife. The gasping breaths of the three filled the confined space. Sofia circled the pair, the heavy iron skillet in her hands, looking for an opening. The fear of hurting her sister paralyzing her attack. The kitchen had become a whirlwind of chaotic violence. "I'll break her neck, you witch!" El Chacal shouted, his voice hoarse with pain, trying to regain control of the situation. It was the spark Leticia needed. Gathering the last ounce of her courage, she leaned forward and bit the hand holding her with the force of an animal. The shock of the pain made him loosen his grip for a split second, pushing her aside. It was enough. Sofia did not hesitate. With a cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, she moved in and brought the heavy iron skillet down on the side of El Chacal's head. The sound of the impact was hollow and sickening, echoing louder than the storm outside. His eyes rolled back, and his body collapsed to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The silence that followed was absolute. El Chacal lay motionless on the floor of the destroyed kitchen, a pool of blood beginning to form under his head. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, the battle was over. Sofia and Leticia, breathless, bruised, and covered in filth, stood over the man who had terrorized them. The adrenaline began to recede, giving way to a profound exhaustion that was both physical and spiritual. They felt no triumph, only a cold emptiness. They looked at each other over the body of their enemy, and in their eyes was not the image of heroines or vigilantes, but only the reflection of two old murderers, alone in the midst of the carnage they had created in their own home. The storm outside had ceased, leaving behind clean air and a profound silence that was mirrored inside the house. In the hours that followed, the two sisters worked with a synchrony born of necessity and shared horror. There were no words, only actions. They cleaned the kitchen, scrubbing the blood from the floorboards, collecting the broken shards, writing. The furniture. Every movement was methodical, ritualistic. It was an act of purification, not of their souls, but of their territory. They were erasing the battle, rewriting the narrative of that night, transforming a scene of carnage back into a home. By dawn, with El Shacal's body already buried under the most luxuriant rosebush in the garden, the house was once again immaculate, guarding its deadly secret under a veneer of normality and domestic order. In the following weeks, a strange and unprecedented peace descended upon the neighborhood. The disappearance of El Shacal and his closest men was noted, but the explanations were whispered and varied. Detective Morales closed the case with relief, officially classifying it as an internal gang war, a convenient solution that required no real work or investigation. The absence of the threat was palpable. The noisy motorcycles fell silent, the extortions ceased, and children returned to playing in the street until dusk. The community, not knowing who to thank, breathed a lighter air. The Plata sisters had performed radical surgery, excising the cancer that afflicted the neighborhood, and the city, in its indifference, simply accepted the cure without questioning the method. The sisters' routine resumed with terrifying precision. They went back to sitting on their porch, selling their homemade sweets, greeting neighbors with gentle smiles. Anna, the young single mother, now walked past them without fear, and one day she stopped to thank them. "I don't know what happened, but things are better. Your presence here, always so calm, gives us a sense of security," she said with moving sincerity. Leticia merely nodded, while Sofia smiled, a smile that did not reach her eyes. They had become what they had always appeared to be, frail, silent pillars of the community. The irony was that the peace everyone felt emanated not from their innocence, but from the terrifying power they now secretly held. And so, the final image freezes at dusk. Sofia and Leticia, sitting in their rocking chairs on the porch, watching the quiet street. The soft evening light softens their wrinkled faces, making them seem the personification of serenity and peaceful old age. They had achieved what they wanted. Their home was an inviolable sanctuary, and peace reigned in their small world. But at what cost? The camera slowly pulls back, leaving them in their stillness, two motionless figures in a painting of domesticity. The conclusion is chilling in its ambiguity. Are they guardian angels or disguised demons, protectors or monsters? The story offers no answer, only the uncomfortable truth that beneath the most innocent facade may lie the coldest and most calculating of darknesses. The journey of the Plata sisters ends here, in a peace bought with violence and silence. They became the justice that was denied to them, an invisible and absolute power in their small universe. Their story forces us to question our own limits and the nature of the darkness that inhabits the human heart when all hope is lost. I'm deeply grateful to you for accompanying me to the end of this disturbing account. It is your support, your subscription to the channel, that allows me to continue delving into these complex and dark narratives, proving that the most important stories are often the ones that challenge us the most. Together, we can continue to give a voice to these forgotten tales, revealing the truths that hide in the